Hello, Hamataki. My name is Nick Estes. I'm speaking into a microphone, but it's not amplified. It's actually for the podcast. So we are listening. There's going to be millions of people listening at home. So yeah, no pressure. But yeah. But we're all very excited to have a friend and comrade and colleague, Noura Erakat, here to talk about the connections between struggles here for decolonization of Turtle Island, as well as Palestine. And this is a very important event co-hosted by the UNM Kiva Club, as well as the Department of American Studies. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Noura Erakat's work, you can listen to her on Democracy Now! She does a lot of amazing interviews. She's like the only person that I know who has a steel trap mind who can just like pull up random dates and times and laws is John Redhouse, actually. And he's a Navajo resistor who we draw a lot of inspiration from. So last night, Noura Erakat this is the only time I've ever seen anybody do a Lannan presentation without notes. And so she gave a talk at the Lenzik in Santa Fe last night, no notes or anything. But she was like, UN Law Resolution 1038. And it was amazing. Subsection, this and that. But yeah, so her book is for sale. It's a really wonderful book. We will be talking a little bit about the details of that book, but more importantly, we're going to be looking and exploring the connections between indigenous struggles here in connection with Palestinian struggles. And also not just indigenous struggles here, but also how they're connected to movements, for Black liberation, migrant justice as well. So I think a lot of this conversation is going to be really relevant. And I guess I'll also introduce the other co-panelists. Melanie Yazzie is an assistant professor of Native American Studies and American Studies here at the University of New Mexico. She's Dene. She's also my partner. And yeah. And then also we have our Tesuke sister, Justine Tiba, who was recently in Palestine, actually, as part of a delegation with Dream Defenders or U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And she's also one of our lead organizers with the Red Nation. So she's going to be offering some very kind of movement-oriented pieces or perspectives on this work, this very important work that goes beyond the confines of just the academy. And we also had a fourth panelist, Samia Assad, who is not with us right now. She's dealing with a family emergency. She might be joining us a little bit late. So without further ado, let's give our panelists a round of applause.
So, marhaba, salam. And thank you for allowing me to be here in your company and in your audience. This is really, really exciting for me on multiple levels. Number one, this actually is the culmination of almost a year-long journey of traveling with Justice for Some across the globe. Before it was out, I started in Australia, but then, have been also to Canada, and then most recently to Hawaii, in Palestine, across the United States. It's so significant that I am ending here in the company of compas from the Red Nation as we are linking together a joint struggle for liberation. That when we are talking about Palestine, we are not just talking about Palestinians. We are not just talking about a singular national liberation struggle. We are talking about a structure of oppression that links together capitalism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, structures of domination that affect all of our lives. And being able to examine those pieces and how we're connected is why, when in fact I want to say free Palestine, I'm also saying free everybody, right? When I say free Palestine, I'm thinking about also Jewish relatives who are also seeking liberation against a white supremacist structure that has produced and continues to produce anti-Semitism. When I say free Palestine, I am talking about my family here in their struggle against settler colonialism and ongoing desecration of lands and peoples and bodies. I am also talking about the end of racial capitalism and racial terrorism in the United States that has been, to make everybody comfortable, is discussed as racism that can be addressed with cultural diversity and understanding, rather than actually dismantling systems that have entwined the marginalization and subjugation of Black bodies with economic structures like the prison industrial complex, but even more significant than that, the way that we understand ourselves as human. The way that we understand ourselves as human. So it's so important to end here. And so thank you for having me and being in your company. This is going to be an informal talk. It's not a book talk. It's an informal talk about what does freedom look like from Turtle Island to Palestine. So I want to then begin by addressing why I identify as a settler in North America, even though my family is forcibly removed from Palestine, even though we didn't come to the United States with the intent to settle or to remove indigenous peoples. The truth is that when we came here, we came under settler sovereignty. And the fact that I adhere to that settler sovereignty and not to the sovereignty of the Piscataway Nation on the lands where I live is what, for me, defines me as a settler and the responsibility I want to take. And I identify that as a structure. In the academic literature, there is discussion about, well, if you don't have the intent to settle, are you in fact a settler? Are you instead just an arrivant? And I think that all of that obscures what is in fact a structural relationship that defines my presence in antagonism to Native presence, that defines my lack of identifying as a settler as somehow complicit with the ongoing removal and erasure of Native peoples, with their musification as mascots, relics of history, things to be used as aesthetic props, right? All of those things that make us believe that the settler colonization that takes place here in the United States, or in North America, I should say anyway, is somehow something of the past that now we can't rectify, but in fact is ongoing, and we are participating in it when we fail to address and raise up this structural condition. So that's why I identify as a settler. So let me then move into how I come to do that. I had the privilege of writing this book, even though it's the project of about 15 years of my own struggle, it's advocacy, research, struggle. I wrote it in the past 3 years. And in those past 3 years, what we saw was the height of a resurgent movement, and the movement for Black lives, as well as indigenous struggles against the Keystone Pipeline, against the Dakota Access Pipeline. We are seeing once again this vivid reminder of how settler colonialism is ongoing. And that's also been reflected in the academic literature, which has raised up settler colonialism and indigenous studies as a framework to be reckoned with. What does that mean? We might understand what colonialism is. And it's really, and the truth is that historically, we've only understood colonialism. But to distinguish that from settler colonialism is so important because they are two different systems with two different relationships between the settler and the native that produce two different outcomes and have two different purposes, if not many different purposes. And those distinctions are quite relevant, that I benefit from, both in my teaching and in my scholarship and in my activism. So brief kind of 101 on that difference. If we understand colonialism, if you think about the settler that travels from the metropole into the colony, the settler maintains their sovereignty in the metropole from which they left. And their relationship to the native is one of dominance, extraction, and exploitation. And the purpose, to the benefit of that colonial structure, is to reproduce that relationship, to continue to extract resources and to extract labor and to continually dominate. In contrast, in a settler colonial structure, when the settler travels from the metropole, they travel with their sovereignty to the colony with an intent to stay, with an intent to stay and to supplant the native with their own body. And so their purpose is then to remove the native in order to replace them in an ongoing process of erasure and removal that takes on many different forms, including dispossession, concentration into reservations or Bantustans, forced displacement beyond the border, outright killing, and sometimes just cultural annihilation through forced assimilation, right? And so there the relationship is not one of exploitation necessarily. It is one where the purpose of the colonial settler is to make the native invisible. And that's incredibly relevant when we think about the relationship between Turtle Island and Palestine, because for so much of our struggle as Palestinians and as Native peoples, our struggle has been to exist. Our struggle has been to tell the world, we exist, we are here. When Bernie Sanders is up on the mic on a presidential panel talking about the humanity of Palestinians in Gaza, that is because Palestinians have refused to disappear, refused to be called a motley bunch of refugees from the 22 surrounding Arab states, refused to accept that we are just a part of Jordan, refused to accept that we were just there in order to antagonize Jewish refugees. And so the narrative goes, right? We are there. We've been there. And you know that we're there because so much of the Israeli project has been to deny that we existed, to politicize. How many of you, I went to college at a time when even saying I was Palestinian got me in trouble. Got me in trouble. Because somehow that was seen as offensive and anti-Semitic. Because my existence is what is at stake, right? Because then you trouble the settler narrative that this land was theirs, that they are native to it, that they were here all along, that it was destined for them, and that our presence was somehow either a blip in history or something that was made up in order to terrorize another population, whether it be Palestinians or Dineh or Lakota or otherwise. So it's very critical that we think about that settler colonial structure. And its relationship then to other forms of, structures of racism and oppression. But why then is that relevant to our futures? And so here we get into, once we identify that settler colonialism is a structure, and we can discuss our condition under that framework and our future under that framework, it allows us to do a number of things, including, number one, to stop exceptionalizing Israel or the United States or any other example of settler colonization. So when I speak and people say, but you're singling out Israel, absolutely not. That's the exact opposite of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell you it's one of many. And so it's why for me it was incredibly relevant to have been in Canada, to have been in Australia, to have, I haven't necessarily been to New Zealand or to West Papua, but I'm here in the United States. And so all of those are examples of settler colonies. And how do you achieve settler decolonization? In some models, it's the settler who prevails by diminishing the population of the native so that they become less relevant and they become less of a threat, right? So you diminish the population through genocide. That has happened here. That has happened in Australia, despite the resistance and the resilience of Native people to continue to exist. In Palestine, that's not the case. The demographic balance is distinct and quite significant. And it's why the issue of refugees is so central and so significant. Because if you cut out 6 million refugees, you've basically erased them and their claims to the land. That's why when the Trump administration cuts $364 million to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, this is not just about a condition of either we're going to take away the money from you until you surrender or we'll starve you to death. This is also about changing who has claims to this land, right? That is what is at stake. And so our demographic balance makes the case of Palestine quite distinct from other cases of settler colonization, and why it becomes who gets to be a Palestinian is really a place and a terrain of contest, right? So when the Trump administration announces that East Jerusalem is the Israeli capital, the United Israeli capital, we're not upset because you took away our future capital of a nascent state, because there is no state. The state has been gobbled up. We don't have enough maps, and sometimes we can't show maps. So when MSNBC tried to show maps on television, they got taken down. There's a reason, because there is no state, and that's a false discourse that's used in order to perpetuate ongoing settler colonization under the veneer of peacemaking. But for Palestinians who heard that announcement about Jerusalem, it wasn't that we lost our capital. It was now that we didn't have a right to be there, that we don't belong. And in Jerusalem right now is one of the most intense programs of forcible displacement. That's the language in international law, but it also translates to ethnic cleansing. In the Jerusalem Municipal Plan of 2000, the balance of Jewish Jerusalemites to Palestinian Jerusalemites is 60% to 40%. And the Jerusalem Municipal Plan outlined that by 2020, they wanted to shift the balance to 70-30 from 60-40, okay? It's an explicit policy of reducing the Palestinian population who are in Jerusalem not as a matter of right, but as a matter of privilege. And they use a residency regime in order to exercise that privilege so that you can have your Jerusalemite status revoked if you do not live in the center of the city for 7 years. So if you decide as a young student from Jerusalem to go study at Columbia University to get your undergraduate and then your law degree, that's 7 years right there. You can't go home. You can't go home. When I, as a Palestinian without residency status, because my father's status was revoked without due process, every time I approach that border, and an Israeli soldier gets to decide whether or not I'm allowed entry, that is the moment I'm either still a part of Palestine and I get to be there, or I officially become an exiled refugee. All of this is a process of ongoing removal. So settler colonization is successful when it actually erases that history. Not in our dominance, but in our erasure. When we begin to accept Israel as a natural entity that has always been there and will always be there. And we now just have to figure out a way to accommodate that political entity in order to exist within it, right? So what does settler decolonization mean? And there's many, I was beginning to mention, there's many possible outcomes. The outcome that I would like to think is one that I'm also articulating in this book, is one where we get through to decolonization is whatever we want it to be, right? Whatever we want it to be, right? So there's some frameworks that have said decolonization is the removal of the settler. But for the vast majority of Palestinians, they have never asked or demanded that Jewish Israelis be removed. They have only asked that they relinquish the right to be masters of the land. That has been the demand. It is the settler to cease being a settler and to be a part of that land. How do we get to that future? This is the big question that we should be asking ourselves. There's many proposals. One proposal is an equality framework. I have concerns with the equality framework because it's, as all equality frameworks, it sets up the dominant person and the dominant subject as the measure and the standard of freedom, so that women demand equality right now in the United States. When they let women be equal, we're basically saying, can we have as much as men have, right? But what would it look like if we were allowed to define what would a woman's world look like? What do women need in order to thrive? What would the workplace look like? What would my weekends look like? Maybe I'd rather have a week off every month than have a weekend off at the end of every 5 days, right? What are the possibilities when I get to dream in that way? And so I push back on an inequality framework that centers Israeli life as my horizon and standard of freedom and living. I want to work through decolonization. And if that means I want to actually be able to create a future for myself and for Jewish Israelis better than Israel has been able to offer. And so that's the opportunities that we have. And I'm really excited to be here to think through what that decolonization work looks like when we don't just want to sit at the table that's been made available to us. We want to reconstruct this thing. Let's build it anew so that it feels different for all of us and not something that we have to accept and accommodate, but that actually reflects who we are and what we can be. Thank you.
Pure fire. Oh, this isn't amplified. Sorry, pure fire. This is for the podcast. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's all go. For those powerful words. So again, I'm Melanie Yazzie. For folks who don't know who I am, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Native American Studies and American Studies here at UNM. I did my PhD in American Studies here at UNM as well. I graduated 3 years ago with my doctorate. And the reason why I'm foregrounding that, I want to describe a bit and kind of chart my path, how I came to this work, how I came to be at this table with Noura Erakat, right? And how I came to be at this table with Red Nation colleagues. And it has everything to do with Palestine. And it has everything to do with my experience actually here at UNM. I entered the program in 2009, and then 2.5 years later went to Palestine on a delegation that was sponsored between the Departments of Anthropology and American Studies here at UNM. Alex Lubin was the chair of the American Studies Department at that time. He's an important figure. His mother, Barbara Lubin, runs the Middle Eastern Children's Alliance out of the Bay Area, which is historically one of the most important Palestine solidarity organizations in the United States. And they actually did all the logistics for our delegation. So it was like 25 undergraduate and graduate students from various departments across the university. Many of us were American Studies and anthropology students, went on a 10-day delegation. We flew into Amman, Jordan, and then we crossed the border from Jordan into the West Bank, and then, spent several days there talking to human rights lawyers, talking to activists, just kind of visiting, doing some olive tree picking, right? Just doing the things that delegations, I now understand, is really common for a lot of delegations in Palestine. And I remember when Alex approached me, he approached me. He actually called for a meeting. So I went into his office and he was like, "You need to go on this delegation." And I was like, "I don't know what Palestine is." I was like, "I don't know what it has to do with Native issues in the United States." And he's like, "Just trust me." And so I was like, okay. Because he had actually found the money to get me into the program here in the first place. And any of you who know Alex know that he's a visionary and incredibly supportive of radical revolutionary work. He's kind of behind the scenes in that way. And so I trusted him, and we raised enough money to pay for the plane ticket, which wasn't covered by the university. Farah was also on this delegation, one of my comrades and colleagues here. And so we went to Palestine. When I got back, it changed my life. And I think the delegations to Palestine, for a lot of us who do political work in the United States, changed the trajectory of our political commitments, as well as our understanding of what constitutes politics. And I learned, in fact, about settler colonialism and decolonization more in my 10 days in Palestine than I had probably in the entire history of my education, particularly in higher education institutions. Here in the United States, over the course of it had been about 7 years at that point, right, that I had been doing my BA, MA, and then my PhD program. And so everything that Noura just articulated about what is a settler colonial context, what are the politics of decolonization in response to settler colonialism, this is my education on that came from Palestine. And so I didn't do a whole lot. Red Nation didn't exist in 2011. We didn't form until 2014, about 3.5 years later, actually, after I returned from Palestine. So there wasn't like a political vehicle to do organizing on Palestine. So I was doing some presentations in the academic circuit here at UNM and other larger academic conferences like the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association conference. But these conferences were really important because what was also happening in kind of the 2011 to 2014 time period was the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign was really taking off. There were academic associations as well as university campuses that were hotly debating BDS in those contexts, having debates about votes, about whether or not BDS should be adopted in academic associations. So here I was, like a young kind of PhD student rising into my own, and there was this growing conversation around Palestine that was happening. And here at UNM, there was a very vibrant Students for Justice in Palestine chapter also during that period. Not so vibrant anymore, right? But there was sort of this confluence of things going on that I think really, it was a good time to get involved with work on Palestine as somebody who maybe did not know quite as much about it, because there was just a lot of stuff going on. And so I remember I was on the board for the Navajo Studies Conference. The Navajo Nation, Navajo people, we have our own sort of nation-centered studies, field of studies. It's called Diné Studies or Navajo Studies. I was on the board at the time, and I was like, I want to do a panel on Palestine in the Navajo Nation. I'm not sure that had ever happened, ever, in the history of Navajo people. And it was myself and a few other comrades, and it was a packed house. I mean, I think there were about 50 people. It was kind of standing room only. And so we did kind of like a Palestine 101. It was almost exclusively Navajo or Diné people. And people like were coming to this for the first time, right? They didn't really know what this was about. And so that was my first sort of foray into doing organizing on Palestine in the community, sort of out on the land, and talking about settler colonialism in this way. And seeing the success of that, I think really bolstered my commitment to political organizing around Palestine, because that was in 2015, maybe about 6 months after the very first Red Nation meeting happened around our kitchen table when we were living in the South Valley of Albuquerque. By we, I mean Nick and I. Sorry, I'm on the podcast. Not Noura. Noura was not around my kitchen table in 2014. Noura was there in spirit. Oh, yeah. And so the Red Nation, as some of you may or may not know, the Red Nation came into existence at a time when there was also another vibrant anti-police brutality movement happening in Albuquerque. We were starting to do work with urban, kind of unsheltered, poor and working class populations. What we later came to understand as border town violence, the particular dynamics of settler colonialism in reservation border towns, Albuquerque being a border town, meaning that it's adjacent to, right, large tribal land bases. And so we were doing work on border town violence. There was all of this work on police violence happening. And then Palestine was really present here in the organizing culture at UNM. And so when the Red Nation came into existence in the fall of 2014, Palestine was always at the forefront of what we were doing. There was like no question about it. Even if our political development on the question of Palestine was still development, right? We were still trying to understand those politics and the kind of debates that were happening in the public sphere with Stephen Salaita's. It wasn't really a firing with him being removed, right, from the University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign. The kinds of attacks, Zionist attacks against SJP members here at UNM that were happening, right? There was a clash happening in the public sphere around the political question of Palestine. And so we were very much coming into our own as the Red Nation when this was all happening. And so throughout the last 5 years of Red Nation's existence, I think that we have done a lot of work to develop and to sharpen our politics on Palestine. And the question of what does it mean, right? The joint struggle for liberation that we as Native people of these lands share with our Palestinian relatives. We've done a lot of work with large Palestine solidarity organizations, not just Mecca, right, which is the delegation, the organization that sponsored my delegation. Nick and I gave keynotes at the JVP convention 2.5 years ago in Chicago. There's a crowd of like 1,200 people. It was kind of like a weird rock star moment. But the reason why that was a rock star moment is because that was the moment when we got on stage and I was like, Judith Butler is up here telling us that liberalism is the answer. And I actually get to get up here and be like, liberalism is not the answer. Like decolonization is the answer, right? And so that was kind of a moment where we were like, whoa, we can actually help to guide this discourse from an Indigenous perspective, a very radical left Indigenous perspective in the United States about what Palestine means, not just to Indigenous people, but to leftists, right? To people who are progressives and radicals on the left-leaning side of politics. And since then, the Red Nation has only deepened its commitment. We've now sent, I think, 8 comrades to Palestine on different delegations. We produced our very first hard one, like it was a lot of work to produce our position on Palestine. We decided that one of the most important first things that we could do as the Red Nation is to articulate what our position on Palestine was, right? Where we had started in 2014 and then where we arrived at on September 6th of this year, 2019, so it's just 2.5 months ago, actually, that we adopted this position on Palestine, where had we grown? How had we changed? And how could we articulate this and create a document and a vision for joint struggle that, again, wasn't just about Indigenous people, but it was also about a really vibrant, expansive kind of vision of decolonization? And how can this be sort of a guiding framework for others who are sort of struggling, right? Struggling to try to understand how we engage in this work. And so we arrived at that on September 6th. We had our General Assembly, which is like when all Red Nation members come together and we debate, adopt or don't, table different kinds of important things politically within the organization. And since then, the statement has been translated into Arabic. And my understanding is it's being shared, actually, throughout Palestine, which is really exciting. We would welcome feedback, I think, on this statement. Like all political statements that arise out of struggle, it's imperfect, right? It reflects where we are in that given historical moment on how we are understanding and trying to articulate the political conditions, right, that we're struggling in. And what I mean by that is that we are trying to build a movement, right? And so when we draft these types of things like statements, they're not like a definitive kind of position on something that seems to be important to a lot of people, but it's something that we hope can be a vehicle to grow movements, right? So that we can mobilize more people and understand perhaps why Palestine or why Indigenous people or land-based struggle is so central to all of our visions of liberation, right? Speaking of intersectionality, speaking of joint struggle. And so this is where that statement really came from. So this is a little bit of my trajectory through the work. This being said, the question of decolonization, like what does that mean? I think Noura did a fantastic job outlining what settler colonialism is. But I now teach about Palestine in my Intro to Native American Studies class here at UNM. Yeah. And you know, it's like fascinating. We covered MMIW in class. I mean, we were talking about boarding schools. My students were bawling. I mean, we were talking about like border town violence. We were talking about the heavy shit, right, that Native people have experienced historically because of US settler colonialism. But it was Stephen Salaita's chapter from his book Internationalism that my students were like, this unsettles me. Even my Native students didn't quite know what to make of it. And one of the things that Steve says in that chapter, as he says, you know, we spent a lot of time kind of understanding and deconstructing the mechanics of colonial violence, of settler colonialism. He's like, I'm not quite sure we've spent enough time strategizing and envisioning together what decolonization looks like. He's like, I want to spend more time on that side of things. And I think as somebody who transitioned from being a scholar that was very much kind of an establishment, institutionalized person, when I went to Palestine in 2011, to then being a part of the Red Nation and just being much more politically engaged on the ground, right, in a revolutionary organization, which is what the Red Nation is, I became more interested, right, in the question and like sort of the praxis of decolonization in that way. And so I really take my instruction from Stephen in that particular chapter that my students were grappling with, but that I return to a lot, right, and how we think about decolonization. And for me, again, because this is very much like thought in process, my thought just doesn't come from reading books or sort of an abstraction of the material. It comes out of struggle itself. You read the conditions of struggle so that you can push struggle forward. That's what I was taught. That's what I've been taught by ancestors who've been doing this kind of revolutionary work for much longer than I have. And so kind of reading where we're at right now and thinking about intersectionality, thinking about joint struggle, that decolonization, as I think Noura pointed out in the context of Israel and Palestine, as a Native person from Turtle Island, I'm not terribly invested in like kicking all Europeans out. I mean, we do joke about the reverse Mayflower in the Red Nation. So it's like, go home pilgrim, you know? So that's just a thing to remind people that they're on stolen land, you know? Like sometimes you have to remind people that is the case. But that what we were seeing in Standing Rock, and I think what we've seen emerging from Indigenous struggle, what I'm now understanding is the entire Western Hemisphere. It's not just North America. Like land-based struggle, people who are rising up against resource extraction, specifically things like Standing Rock, the passing of the Mother Earth Accords, right, in a place like Bolivia, is that Decolonization does not require the removal of people from land, but it requires us to have a different relationship with land, right? And that we cannot actually decolonize if we continue to engage in a legal or even a moral, right? A legal, moral, or cultural relationship with the land, the way that it is structured by settler sovereignty. Not just settler sovereignty in the United States, but sort of writ large, I would say across the hemisphere. And so we have to create a new program. We have to remind ourselves how to relate with the land, with the water, right? To make kinship in a way that's based on values that are fundamentally different than the values that drive settler relationality with land, right? And so this is how I've been thinking about decolonization. Because you always get this refrain from like that person in the audience who's like, so do I have to go back to Europe? I'm like, sometimes I feel like you should. But no. Like, I'm not a heartless asshole like that. I actually care about the future of everyone. I care about the future of humanity. And I care that we have a different relationship with the land, which is dying, right? And I think that this is one of the most important lessons from indigenous people who've been rising up and engaging actively in developing decolonization struggles here. And so I think that this resonates. There's something about Palestine within these larger indigenous movements that I think has really helped us to think through this and then to also activate it in the way that we're struggling in this context. So that's how I would answer the question about decolonization. And of course, you have to build the movements for decolonization. It's not like I can write about it and then all of a sudden, you know, we're like, okay, let's have this thought project about it. Like what the Red Nation is interested in doing is building a movement for decolonization that includes millions, let's hope. Let's hope that happens, you know, here in North America, because this is what it's going to take to save our collective future, right? And so I think Palestine has everything to do with our collective future. It's not just about Palestine. Just as the indigenous struggle for decolonization here has to do with our collective future, it's not just about me as like a Diné person. And so these are just the thoughts that I have about these things. I'm gonna pass it to Justine, and then I think we're gonna be in conversation about stuff. Thank you, Akat.
Waku. Hello, everybody. My name is Justine Tiba, Tusuki, Santa Clara Pueblos, and yeah, howdy. I'm just a small-time little dusty res girl at a at a table with all these big timers. Damn. Yeah. So. Just kidding. I'm the baddest bitch that ever lived. Anywho. Yeah, this is my part where I talk my piece. So, yeah, I just got back from Palestine a couple weeks ago. I went the 9th through the 17th, I think. I was there for like a week. Yeah, it was actually because of the Red Nation, because I've been a member for about a year now, this month, and honestly felt like totally desensitized by the time I got there. Like I got there and I was just like, yep, this happens back home. Yeah, like every single thing I was able to relate to a specific like time and place in the process of colonization over here with my own people. And before I left, I was trying to make sense of what this delegation was going to be, what it means for a Pueblo woman to be in Palestine, and what my duty is. And I started thinking about my own relation with settler colonialism. And I remember when I was young, I think I was still in like, I want to say like around like kindergarten, first grade, my grandpa brought home this map, and it was like in a frame, but it was actually it was this map. And it showed it shows native land, or it shows like the process of our land being stolen, and it shows it until we are in reservations, and then those reservations get smaller. And in this map, it was a giant map. It shows the framing through the years. And I was just a child at the time, and I remember like the last map of it was a completely grayed out map, and it had a question mark in it, as if to imply the logic of settler colonialism, which is that there will be no native lands left after that. And you see it shrink smaller and smaller and smaller, and then that gray question mark pops up, like, what's going to be indigenous lands next? And in my child mind, I was like, we're not going to have any lands left. And so that was like sort of one of the things that was like a spark in the dark for me as a child. And then growing up into it, you know, I had a lot of crazy rowdy years until I got to the Red Nation. And then we started talking about Palestine, and I didn't know what Palestine was. I was piecing it together, and the longer I spent in the Red Nation, the more I knew about it. And then I saw the map of Palestine, which is the same. I think it's, yeah, if you want to click it on the next tab. Yeah, then I saw that map. And it really just like locked it all into place for me. It clicked. I knew that settler colonialism wasn't just something limited to here in the United States and with my own people. And then that's when I saw Palestinians as indigenous, and how they, how we have our, how we're going through the same struggle. And that's how I was able to relate it globally. And now I understand that, you know, our struggles are one and the same, and our struggles aren't just limited to my own Pueblo res, where it relates to the entire world. And that was a really big breakthrough for me, because Pueblo people are very somehow even my mom's like, why does Palestine matter? We have problems here. We got as if our ultimate freedom is to create perfect Pueblo utopias, which is not something that does not equate our freedom, or that is not equivalent to our freedom, because we're not going to be free unless we are all free. And that's kind of how I started thinking about it more and more. And so, so yeah. And so, yeah. And so that was kind of like a moment where it was just like, boom, lights on. And it was kind of, and it's only because I traveled to that light in the darkness that is the Red Nation. And that's where I found the switch. And now my mind is like in a never ending process of blowing its brains out every single day. Yeah. And so now I understand, you know, I do understand our problems as one and the same now. I do understand these things globally, and I understand it in an international framework. And what does it mean for us to decolonize? And it's like, you know, I feel like we sometimes we sometimes forget that indigenous people exist all over the world. And sort of working myself out of, like, you know, being so centered in the US was also like a big breakthrough for me too. And so that's how I've come to find out, like, how and why this matters. And so when I was in Palestine, it's like you see all of these things, and you see indigenous people who've been colonized for far less time than we have been colonized. And we go to their old cities, and, you know, it made me think of the adobe cities that we were robbed of as Pueblo people. And it made me think, could Palestinians, with the same logic of settler colonialism, could Palestinians become us? Could they be us? Could they be 2% of the population? Could they have, you know, could they ever be annihilated into being us? And so that's I don't believe so, because I believe in the revolution. The rev's gonna hit, dog. I refuse to believe that Palestinians will be like us, and that's because of our what the Red Nation is trying to do. I owe all of this political development to the Red Nation, and we refuse to let our earth die. We refuse to let our people die. And so, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I'm just going to hop straight to why does it matter? How do we move forward? We want our fucking land back, dog. But yeah. So that's my gist. All right, so we're gonna converse.
Just a quick time check. We have about 30 more minutes. So you've answered all the questions that we kind of came up with. So, I would just like to, we're done. I'd just like to reflect on some of these things. One of the things that Noura brought up is, and Justine brought this up too, is the minoritization of Indigenous people. They're making of us into a minority of a minority. And I think about this in the context of like what's happening, not just in North America, but throughout the hemisphere, where Indigenous people are not the minority, right? That brown people are not the minority. And I began thinking about this way, like what Melanie was talking about is like, what does it mean to relate to non-Indigenous people? And is there a framework for that? And I think of, projects such as like the 1619 Project, when we talk about when slavery came to this land and how inaccurate that project is, and how it actually globs onto a U.S. national narrative. And there's lots of, I'm not trying to knock anybody or anything, but there's a lot of native narratives that do that as well, to say that we are the original Americans, we're the best Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth of the matter is, in the early 1500s, there was a Spanish conquistador who brought African and indigenous slaves from the Caribbean to a place in what is today, or what is currently, South Carolina, and tried to establish the first European settlement in what later became the United States. The indigenous people learned to make some kind of communications with the surrounding Guales, who were the indigenous people of that particular area, and began communicating with their African relatives and comrades about planning a slave revolt. And the first European settlement that was on this territory, and I think it was in 1523, was overthrown by a slave revolt of indigenous and African people. The first, you should clap for that. That's the story. That's the origin story of where we should begin. The first non-indigenous permanent inhabitants of this land were self-emancipated African slaves. And why that is important is because if we think about this, this colonial holiday that just happened, Thanksgiving, and we're a nation of immigrants or whatever, it assumes that anything can only be a settler identity. And I think of the late Vine Deloria Jr. He made this very apt point in Custer Died for Your Sins, but also We Talk, You Listen, where he pointed out that there were three groups of people who became citizens of this nation as groups of people, and not as individuals, and not as individual settlers. And the first were Mexicans through the annexation of where we are right now. The second was freed African slaves. And the third were Native Americans. And we share a sense of peoplehood and collective identity because under the US Constitution, we have group rights and we see ourselves. And so our relationship to this nation has always been one of not individual versus the state, but collective group versus the state, right? The colonizing state. And so I think there's room to think beyond just a binary of native settler and to think more expansively about these relations. And so I want to throw it back to you all to kind of maybe riff on that.
No, I think it's really important. And this is the obviously the risk of taking up anything as a structural issue. We begin to be stuck in that structure and not able to look beyond it, right? And so I just want to I want to thank you for raising that, and also to emphasize that the structure and the analytical framework of settler colonialism is not the end of the discussion. It's just a place to begin, right? That opens up a number of possibilities. And in fact, much of the way that I'm envisioning ways forward seeks to disrupt a native settler binary so that we can see alliances across. So for example, if you think about racial alliances that are possible in Palestine and Israel, right? One of the alliances I would like to envision is one that happens with Middle Eastern Jews, who are known as the Mizrahim, which is a colonial label that strips them of their connection to the rest of the Middle East and bifurcates very violently their identity as Arab and Jewish. They cannot be both Arab and Jewish. If they're Jewish, they are Israeli and not Arab. And if they are Arab, they are not Israeli. And this was not a mistake. This is part of the creation of Israel recreating itself and recreating and redefining who is the new Jew, who is rectifying a history of subjugation, of feminization, and genocide, right? To then become a new figure of the sabra, the soldier, the very masculine, but also very white European, right? And so what happens when we complicate that story and seek to look at what are the alliances between Palestinians and Iraqi Jews or Yemeni Jews or, Syrian, Lebanese, Tunisian, Algerian, Moroccan? It's really complicated. And there were moments where the alliances had greater potential. Today, they have even less potential, especially after 1967, where the value of Middle Eastern Jews within Israeli society catapulted, skyrocketed, once their Arabic language skills became now relevant to colonizing the West Bank and Gaza. And they become interlocutors as part of this military force. And now within Israel, there's actually the greatest antagonism against Palestinians is actually among Middle Eastern Jews, right? But that is not coincidental, nor is it natural. Within Israel, the discourse that explains Middle Eastern Jewish antagonism towards Palestinians, they're super religious. They're not as enlightened as we are as Ashkenazi or European Jews, right? They're very Orientalist tropes that describe that antagonism when in fact it's one that's rooted in a history of racialization within Israel that made proximity to the Middle East and to Arab identity as proximity to the possibility of social death. So in order to actually have greater say within Israel, you have to distance yourself from Palestinians. And this, by the way, has a lot of resonance with anti-Blackness in the United States and the way that immigrants are socialized almost immediately to identify as anything but Black. As anything but Black. Don't live in Black neighborhoods. Don't be in a ghetto. Don't identify as Black, right? It's why Arabs... But that's also not just a racism, right? People are not like born with this inept nature to disdain Blackness. But it's one that was created by the United States where even citizenship is contingent on whiteness, where access to land is contingent on whiteness, where access to employment is contingent on whiteness. So the aspiration to whiteness that's made available, obviously never to Black people, but is made available to groups of immigrants, right? Becomes a form of, becomes an aspiration that Arabs have aspired to as well. And where they achieve that status in a series of Supreme Court decisions that culminates in 1915, where Arabs continue to be, by the way, we're white apparently. Despite the war on terror, our surveillance, entrapment, the discrimination, we're white. According to the census. And I say all that to say that this idea of the distance that Middle Eastern Jews have created between themselves and Palestinians is not innate, similar to the distance that, for example, immigrants will practice and the anti-Blackness that they practice is not innate, but is also produced by these systems that seek to separate us. But just as they were created by, people, we can also reverse those. We have the choice of which side of the color line to be on. We have this choice of what kind of future we want to create. And it can be, and it's a lot more risky, but the outcome is much more beneficial.
Yeah, the comment that we have the choice to create what we want to see. I think Noura said earlier that decolonization is anything we want it to be, is really important. I mean, that sounds like very general. It might be a little bit too like wishy-washy for some folks in the audience who are like, what is the path, right, towards decolonization? Give me that plan. The Red Deal is our plan, so you should go read it. It's the Red Nation's plan for decolonization, or at least the beginning of a decolonization process in the United States. But this idea that decolonization is anything you want it to be, I think for me also relates to the fact that human beings, five-fingered beings, right? We all have a right to have relationship with land. We all have a right to make home. We all have a right to make kin. And understanding that is like the basis of how we engage in political work together, I think for me is something that's really important when we're thinking about decolonization. And I think as the book, Noura's book points out, if you were at Noura's talk last night, she talked about the way in which settler sovereignty relies upon essentially like never-ending legal fictions, essentially, right? That continue to alibi and legitimize the theft of land, the erasure of peoples, the removal, kind of the progression, the constant progression of removals and erasures. And it's like, well, if settler sovereignty is just making shit up, right, to alibi what it's doing, like, we can create things. We can build upon different kinds of values and legal frameworks and histories and genealogies to develop our own practice, our own politics, right? Indigenous people, even though we have been reduced to these reservations, right, that the map shows, it's not like we stopped practicing our customary and ancestral forms of governance and political work. It's not called politics. It's not necessarily called law. It's usually just categorized as like culture and mysticism and bullshit like that, right? But what's actually going on in a lot of our social, political, and cultural and familial spaces is law, and it is politics. And sometimes it happens underground, and sometimes it happens in a direct confrontation with the settler state. And so being somebody who teaches in an NAS department, I also am a historian of my own people, specifically political and economic history of my people. I'm very interested in how we build upon, right, these customs and these laws and the political authority of Indigenous people to develop our own frameworks for decolonization. I'm not terribly interested in building upon settler laws in this way. And so thinking about decolonization as whatever we want it to mean, like that to me is what that means. And again, what those customary and ancestral laws and forms of political authority show us is how to be in right relation with each other and with land and with water, right? With all of one's relatives. That's how you are a good relative. And if to be a good relative is the premise of law, then it's automatically different than capitalism, right? Which is hierarchical, it's racialized, it's about exploitation and extraction. The division of humanity between those who die and those who live, right? Those who live is a small group, those who die is a really large group in a global capitalist system. And so for me, this is like a starting point for thinking through this. The no ban on stolen land thing during the Muslim ban was an articulation of this a few years back. So yeah, I just wanted to add that as part of this conversation. I think about decolonization as anything we want it to be, and that everyone has a right to make kin, make home, and have a relationship with land.
Yeah, decolonizing, man. Just kidding. No, but for real though, having a relationship to the land and even just other people is the biggest key to this. I was asked to talk about my geography class, and I hate that class. They just sort of they turn the earth itself into this like object that you can just like control and have, and it's like, where's the relationality in that? And after I got back from Palestine, I did a presentation on my time there and all of that. But I watched Nora's book talk before this, and you were just talking about it now. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me was like sort of like connecting white supremacy and Zionism to all of this. And you said when Zionism was first mobilizing, it was a self-described colonial movement, a movement to gain acceptance within Europe, a movement not to just not to combat white supremacy, but to fit into it. They wanted to be white, and the Arab Jews had to abandon their Arabness to be a part of Israel. And it makes me think of what indigenous people here are doing. We're abandoning our own, you know, sacred ties to the earth in order to in order to live in it, in order to exist in it. Because through this logic of settler colonialism, we are not supposed to exist. And so I feel like as a means to exist in a contradiction of where we're not supposed to exist, we end up coming to these really what are crazy solutions for how we can survive, and that's to be better capitalists and be better capitalists than the most imperialist nation to ever exist. We're not going to do that. We have to abandon that. And so yeah, thank you for recentering like what decolonization is, because it ultimately is dependent on our relationship and our kinship to each other and the land.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say this is just the last question. So, I just wanted to kind of sum up some of the things that I've heard. One is, this idea, there's this kind of like idea or romanticization of illegality, like let's be an accomplice to crimes and things like that. Accomplices, not allies. It's a very popular slogan within certain circles within the kind of progressive left. And I always think about that because I actually know people who are undocumented and who are technically illegal, and it's not something they enjoy, right? It's not something that they romanticize. Or water protectors who are behind bars because they were upholding a different kind of legal order, right? And that's what makes them against the law. And so thinking about decriminalization, thinking about when we do the absence of settler colonialism is the amplification of indigenous legal orders and political orders and cultural orders, right? And that means looking at somebody like a water protector or a land defender or somebody who is illegalized for just being human, for crossing a border, or for trying to establish or maintain or protect a relationship to human or other than human entities, right? And so I think about that as a form of decolonization. And part of that, I think, also begins with a strident feminist praxis. And so we were having a conversation earlier after I cooked y'all stew, which I hope was good. Thank you. You can say that in the microphone.
It was delicious.
But we were talking about like how the struggle in indigenous movements and the Palestinian movement has taken a very feminist approach, and like what that internal struggle is and why it's important for envisioning decolonization.
So I want to answer Nick's question, but I also want to. This is pretty much going to be the last talk for me of the year, and this is exciting. And I want to just share something very personal with you, which is that I have had a really hard time having this conversation because the thing that I've been advocating is for us to exercise a radical imagination, right? I've basically told audience after audience this thing about what is the future that we can imagine that's better for Jewish Israelis? Like, what is the anti-racist Palestinian struggle look like, which is not just inflected with anti-racism, but is about racial justice, right? I've been asking about how are we in better relationship to one another? How do we switch from a sovereignty framework, which is mutually exclusive and based on ownership and governance, to a framework of belonging, which is mutually constitutive and infinite, right? And so every time I've said that, I've had a lot of anxiety as I look into the audience, that's filled with people who, and especially in Palestine, but who are filled with people who are just trying to survive and who don't want that answer, but want to hear things like, how do I get this boot off my neck? How do I stop the next bullet from piercing my child's head, right? How do I protect them from being taken away at 3 a.m. without any due process and being interrogated in language they don't understand, under no law in which to the rest of the world is framed as their fault because their mother raised them to hate Jews? That's the framework. And so it's been really difficult on a very personal level to, come out here and be advocating, let's exercise a radical imagination. Let's free ourselves of the strictures of this political reality and stop confining ourselves to what's possible and demand what is necessary alongside that reality. So I just want to offer something, that there is a way that we can do, and this is my favorite thing in the world, which is both and, not, either or, both and. We can both exercise a radical imagination and participate in a program with concrete asks and concrete things you can do, all right? And those things are not mutually exclusive. So for this audience in this discussion, I'm going to share a few things, right? Just a few things that are within our grasp that we can do, right? And this is just a suggestive list, not an exhaustive one, which is to spur your imagination of how empowered each of you is. You are each agents of change. You each have within your capacity, in your hands, in your body, in your minds, and your spirits, to do something that affects the world around you. And so this is a suggestive list to have you go home and think, well, what is the best way I can do it, all right? Here we go. Number one. The first one is, we know if we want to end U.S. imperialism, kind of a big task, where do we begin to end U.S. imperialism? And that, in my opinion, as taxpayers, begins in our demanding of the end of military aid, right? Demanding of the end of military aid. That could be to, there's wars everywhere. The U.S. is engaged in endless war in the Middle East especially, that is profiting a number of people, right? Trump recently in London was literally saying, I did better than my predecessors because I actually took the oil. He was boasting about it. So there's a lot of money to be made here. This is not just, right? So the demonization of our people is deliberate, okay? So end military aid. And as we dive in, for me, I want to demand end of military aid to Israel because it becomes a window to end military aid elsewhere, but also because Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. aid, more than all of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America combined, right? And we give now, because of Obama, increased that military aid from $3 billion to $3.8 billion a year over a 10-year period in a 10-year MOU. Now, that divestment should also come with a demand for investment. And I would demand for an investment in reparations, right? If you want to be a part of doing something concrete, the largest failure of the civil rights movement was that we defined racism as somehow just a juridical issue, right? And so if we removed the barriers of access and opportunity, we had healed ourselves of a mental health disorder called racism, and we haven't. The test of when we do that is when we enthusiastically pay reparations, enthusiastically rehabilitate those wrongs. And the movement for reparations is deep and textured, and it's never been a demand to line individual pockets, although I'm open to that. But it has been a demand. It has been a demand to build universities, to improve neighborhoods, to build hospitals, to provide better access, to provide free education, right? This isn't about taking away to give to some. This is about benefiting us all. So demand reparations, okay? You want to end endless wars. Do you have members of Congress? Ask them to repeal the authorization for the use of military force, which in 2001 was passed by Congress in order to authorize war against Afghanistan, but has been used since 2001 to the present to continue war in Pakistan, in Yemen, in the Philippines, in Somalia, okay? This is endless war that has no authorization except for this 2001 resolution. Make that demand. What else can we do? Recognize yourself as a settler. Recognize yourself as a settler. Begin to demand, begin to acknowledge that there are things that we can do in our daily lives that work towards settler decolonization, including rejecting mascots, rejecting mythologies of settler erasure, and again, musification, demanding that all Native peoples get free tuition to any schools, anywhere, right? These are ways that we can, these are demands that you make. And if you don't achieve those demands, guess what? You have created some controversy and sparked something in someone's head when you make that argument. So you're creating some sort of political movement. And then another thing that you can do as part of that process is demand a sustainable future. Right? The way that we eat, the way that we extract water, the way that we produce goods, the way that we consume are all unsustainable and are all entwined with Native erasure. So how do we commit to creating, a sustainable relationship in all of our lives that actually on the most micro level you can do, even if you don't like people and you don't want to see them, right? You can do that even on your own, but you can also do that on the larger scale. So I'm going to just end there because I took up way too much time and let my sisters answer the question around feminist leadership.
Damn. So Noura basically just outlined the red deal, which I loved, which you didn't mean to do, but you actually did. Because we're basically like, we need to divest from military and police and carceral institutions, right? It's a very abolitionist framework. And then we need to reinvest in the common humanity of everyone, or reparations, right? And then we need to build a sustainable future, what we're calling healing our planet. Those are like literally the three parts of the red deal. It's an equation, right? You divest, you reinvest, and then you create the pathway towards decolonization and abolition. So we've basically been in conversation with the same shit you have, which is really good to hear. Because you're like an amazing leading thinker, and we take a lot of inspiration from the way you think through things politically. I think the feminism piece, there are so many things that I want to say about it. I don't need to say all of them here, but something that I'm moving forward with in my thinking that has been deeply inspired by all of my Red Nation comrades. The Red Deal is a very collective document that's come out of the Red Nation. It's not just me, it's not just Nick. It's a lot of us working together to try to build this vision, right, for divestment and reinvestment in the common humanity and the earth. And something that is arising, the third part, which is going to be released in January of next year, this demand for a sustainable future, what we're calling healing our planet, really depends upon, I think, caretaking. Caretaking economies. I'm starting to think about caretaking ecologies. Standing Rock was a caretaking ecology and also had caretaking economies in the camps while people were living there, right? This value system I'm talking about, that's a really different way of how we relate to each other and build legal and political and economic structures that aren't based on settler sovereignty and settler laws. Caretaking and the conversation about caretaking is really mostly being theorized and practiced by radical feminists of color, both within academic work, but then also in organizing spaces. I've learned a lot from radical Black feminists who have been doing a lot of work on caretaking within abolition organizing in places like LA, and then also from Indigenous feminists, radical queer Indigenous feminists who I think have really helped us to advance our conversation about relationality and then moving relationality into a caretaking framework. Because when we think about caretaking, it's gendered, right? When you think about a caretaker, you're thinking about a femme-bodied person. You're thinking about a woman. Like, you're thinking about like biological reproduction and the kind of very standard Marxist feminist analysis of the unpaid labor, right, that women do in cleaning homes, in raising children, right? And so the notion of caretaking isn't new, but the way that I think that it's being taken up within the political conversations I've had the privilege of being a part of, it's coming from feminists, it's coming from feminists of color, it's coming from indigenous feminists, it's coming from third world feminists as well, right? As something that this is part of the reparations movement, that we actually have to be developing these frameworks of caretaking. And so for me, that's where I'm seeing feminism really transforming. Like, we're actually in a moment right now in the political struggle where this framework is emerging and we're all building it together in these types of conversations and in these spaces. So that's just my reflection on kind of where we're headed. So I would like for you to pay more attention to caretaking and thinking about that and reading the kind of things people are writing from the abolitionist or decolonization framework, specifically feminists.
Word. Yeah, this past year, I've actually learned that I'm a radical queer indigenous feminist. And that's because none of these movements are going to amount to anything if we're excluding if we're excluding our women, our queer folks and our trans folks. Like, if we leave those people behind, that we're not going to reach freedom by any means. And so feminist leadership is something that I've come to know, and it's something that was completely hidden from me, something that was like a big no-no in my Pueblo. I myself cannot run for Pueblo leadership, nor do I have a say-so or a vote in who gets to be our leaders. And so in the Red Nation, anybody who's a member is inherently a feminist, because we understand that. That's why we made Nick make the stew. No, I'm just kidding.
That's why he's moderating it.
Right. But yeah, so any of these movements is just going to be undoing the patriarchy that the patriarchs left behind. And so that's kind of where I'm at, is sort of like navigating what it means to be a feminist leader, and what it means to listen to our queer and trans femmes, and what it means to center them too. I was first thrown into, I first grasped that during the Entrada protests. Earlier we were talking about boner slicing because so basically the Entrada is just a reenactment of when the Spanish colonizers came back into Santa Fe after 12 years after the Pueblo Revolt to retake the land. But every single that movement alone sort of define what our future movements are, how our future movements are going to go, because every single thing, even the Entrada itself is a rape innuendo, the entry, and we were talking about how in order to do something, even something like abolish the Entrada, we really do have to go around boner slicing all of these patriarchs. We're talking about boner slicing Don Diego de Vargas. We're talking about boner slicing our own tribal leaders. We're talking about boner slicing the mayor of Santa Fe. All of these patriarchal institutions that seek to control us, that, it's, all of these institutions that control women. But even in our own pueblos, we have our so-called sovereignty, but are we really sovereign? I feel like our tribal governments are basically just ambassadors to the United States. We're not actually sovereign. And so one of the last things that these patriarchs have control of is our own indigenous women. And it's something that's clinging to, and we even have to boner slice that. We have to decolonize that. I'm coining it now. Boner slicing is a decolonial term. Just kidding.
Writing it down.
Right. Right. But that's what these movements are. And that's what the Red Nation is. We're building a mass movement. We're reaching to every marginalized person that we know. We're reaching to Palestinians. We're reaching to Venezuela, to Bolivia, to every place where people are occupied, to where this evil of settler colonialism exists. And those are the people that that's how we're going to win. We're not going to win by looking up to these giant erect penises. Nah. Sick. We're not going to get our freedom by begging for it for these patriarchal institutions. We're going to do it from the bottom up, and we're going to do it with radical queer femmes. Yeah. Word.